Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and a little look at HMS Exeter, the newly introduced Tier 5 Premium Heavy Cruiser. Now I am aware there's sort of a bit of controversy in the back end, as it were, with this ship because it underwent some major changes during the course of it being tested, and I kind of missed all that. I've only really played the ship in its release state, and in its release state as a Tier 5 heavy cruiser I would say it's pretty good, maybe even a little bit too good in some aspects, but it's one of those ships where it's good so long as it's left alive to do its thing. If it is, however, targeted heavily by particularly enemy battleships or even enemy heavy cruisers, it can go down hard and fast. Now when I played it, I was basically treating it like I would the Emerald, although it is undoubtedly a lot more effective than the Emerald. The rate of fire is rather slower, and I think actually lower than its real life rate of fire. One of the things that a lot of the community contributors, or at least some of them, were heavily counselling towards, not counselling, that's not the right word, they were heavily, oh come on brain, help me out here. They wanted it to be a tier 6 is what I'm getting at, and instead Wargaming seems to have been completely fixed on it being a tier 5 cruiser. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I mean, it's got a good health pool for its tier. The fact that it's got that heal as well means that it has, I think, the biggest effective health pool. I mean, you're never going to get a perfect use out of all your heals, of course, but yeah, it has got a fair degree of survivability if it's only really other cruisers that are hitting you. It's when the big nasty AP shells start to hit you that things can go south very, very quickly. So you have to be very opportunistic. You have to play it kind of like a hit and run cruiser. It's not especially fast though, so you really do have to play around with islands and hope that you're on a map where you can use said islands. I think about the worst game I've had in this so far, and it's only been like maybe half a dozen games in total, so this is a fairly small sample size I'm working with here. But the lower tier map Strait, where you don't have a lot of island cover to work with, there's a group of islands sort of across the middle constraining the middle cap circle, but the north and south are basically open water, and it doesn't really do well on open water. This is a ship that might actually go along quite well with a smoke buddy. It might in fact be a bit too good if you have a smoke buddy, although it's not like it's super stealthy when it's firing from smoke, but it's more than good enough considering the range of the ship. So how does it compare to, say, the Furataka? Well, probably the biggest advantage the Furataka has over this is that it has basically some armour. In fact, the Furataka's armour is pretty decent for being a tier 5 cruiser. This, on the other hand, not so much. I think it's a little better off than the Emerald, but it still has an above waterline citadel. So yeah, it's quite squashy. You really cannot take the battleship hits. You absolutely have to avoid engaging with battleships if you possibly can. And unlike the Emerald with, is it 4 or 5 torps? This only has 3. So although they're rather good torps, you only have 3 of them. I did, however, occasionally get to use them to some somewhat reasonable effect. This game I land 1 torp hit and probably could have landed more if I'd aimed them a little bit better. But there was another game where I was able to use them to finish off a wounded Giulio Cesare, and it wouldn't have done if he'd had more health than he did, but as it was just enough to kill them. And it was a good thing too, because they were very, very close to killing me. In fact, that's a game where I have decided to put the score screens up at the end, because in some ways it was less interesting than this game. It was a top tier game apart from anything else. And so, although it was a much better damage game, it really wasn't what I wanted to show off with this ship, because I think this replay here, which was in fact the very first game I played, shows off reasonably well what this ship is good at. And what it's good at really is primarily picking on other cruisers. The AP shells are excellent if you can catch other enemy cruisers broadside. The AP against battleships, not so much. You might try using it at close range, but generally speaking, I basically used AP against cruisers and the HE against pretty much everything else. It isn't very effective against destroyers though. The Furattaka kind of has the same problem. It's just the lack of volume of fire, basically. And even firing HE at battleships, although the HE fire chance is pretty good because it's a heavy cruiser and it's not been particularly nerfed in its fire chance, like, say, the Germans, it doesn't really have the rate of fire, so you are entirely reliant on RNG when it comes to setting enough fires to get a sustained amount of damage. But if RNG is on your side, like I said, with the game that I'm not showing you, you know, it was 100,000 damage, and that's not half bad for being top tier. And just overall, I've not been struggling to do damage so long as I've been left alone by the enemy team. So if you see one of these, and particularly if you're in a battleship, it's one of those ships where you probably should prioritise it because, I mean, there's going to be some RNG involved with whether you can hit it or not, but it will eat citadels so readily that even with its availability of a heal, you're going to severely limit their survivability overall because they'll be able to heal that much less back. In this game, I was being really cagey though. I mean, this was a decent map for this ship, and I've got enemies that are approaching this point, battleships particularly that I don't want to engage, and so I've got my torps out, as has that pink destroyer behind me. That, by the way, you probably saw that earlier on. That was kind of not this guy's fault. The T-22 basically turned in a way that was going to always get themselves beached, so they kind of screwed themselves either way, and the destroyer, the Fubuki, was clearly not expecting them to turn back in towards the island because it was such a silly thing to do. But of course you can never count on that, so that's why you always go by that rule of thumb of just don't drop torpedoes from behind somebody, even if it seems like it should be safe. You never know, they might do something really silly and run themselves aground and eat one of your torpedoes in the process. So we fairly well won this. I mean, this wasn't particularly a close game, especially. The 100k damage game was even less so, to be honest, but maybe showed a bit more dodging and weaving. It does retain that British cruiser manoeuvrability. I mean, overall, it's got a lot of things going for it. And if you are left alone to just work away at people, yeah, this is a dangerous ship. It's, I think, honestly, the heel that maybe tips it over into the vague area of being overpowered. I wouldn't say it's a definite thing, but it's kind of borderline in my opinion. Maybe if they took away one of the heals, for instance, or if they made the heal a bit less strong. Because in terms of its firepower, in terms of its damage output, I would say this is easily better than Emerald, and it certainly gives the Furattaka a run for its money as well. The one thing that Furattaka can absolutely do better than this is potentially rush down a battleship and put a bunch of torpedoes into their side. In which case the Furattaka has the better armour for it, and it most certainly has the better torpedoes for it. You're going to want to use the single drop on these torps, by the way, because it's either a single drop or the wide spread. For some reason it's not single drop or narrow spread. It doesn't particularly make sense that that's so, but anyway, there you go. So I'm not sure what else there is to talk about on this. AA, maybe? There is a carrier in this game. The AA is quite good for a tier 5 cruiser. I don't think it's super amazing good, but it's good enough to defend yourself, and you do also get a float plane fighter, and those are quite potent these days. So yeah, I think it's more than good enough to shut down tier 4 carriers if they're particularly trying to hurt you, but the tier 4 carriers are honestly kind of terrible at the moment, so there's a lot of ships that don't really have to worry about tier 4 carriers, and this is most certainly one of them. It's also got very good stealth, that's another thing I could mention. Not as good as the Emerald, but it beats the Furataka in that regard as well. It's got better range than Furataka and better stealth. So yeah, overall this is an extremely comfortable tier 5 cruiser, apart from it being so damn squashy. And if you can avoid getting shot at, it's gravy. But if you do get shot at, you know, if a Fuso suddenly takes interest in you, or if, heaven forbid, you're in a tier 7 game and you get a Leon shooting at you, things might go downhill very, very quickly. In fact, you might just get outright deleted. I haven't had too many tier 7 games in it though. As I said earlier, I've only played a couple of games in it overall, so I don't really have a good baseline for how it performs bottom tier so far. Most of my games have either been top tier or mid tier, because I think the matchmaking's a bit weird at the moment still, with the amount of carriers that are around. They may be pulling these sorts of ships into more bottom and mid tier, not bottom, top and mid tier games rather than bottom tier games. So it's just the Ryujo left at this point, and yeah, we've basically won. So I can maybe mention a little about the actual historical ship. It quite famously took part in the Battle of the River Plate versus the Admiral Graf Spee, and you can now recreate that particular battle in World of Warships if you so wish, now that Exeter is here, along with, of course, the Leander class, because it was accompanied by 2 Leander class frigates. And so, yeah, you can recreate that, except I suspect that the Graf Spee would not last very long with one of these and a pair of Leanders firing at it. Unlike real life, where the Graf Spee had a bit more of an advantage, but it was still outnumbered. It did meet a rather sad end though. After the damage it took from Graf Spee, it was sent to dry dock for just about a year, because it was quite heavily damaged in that engagement, and it was then sent to the Far East, where it took part in the Battle of Malaya and was attached to the ill-fated Abdacom, the American, British, Dutch and Australian Joint Command, which was the earliest attempt at a kind of supreme command for any theatre in the war, and that only lasted for a couple of weeks because it was a disaster, and most of the ships attached to Abdacom were sunk, although a couple did manage to flee, but Exeter was not one of them. It was heavily damaged in the first Battle of the Java Sea, where most of Abdacom was completely wrecked, and then as part of the engagements of the second Battle of the Java Sea, this, along with a number of other ships, was sunk. So yes, Exeter didn't last that long in the war overall, but well, it was a war, and stuff like that tended to happen. So there's the score screens from the game I mentioned earlier. Yeah, this was a top tier game where I was engaged a bit more by enemy ships, but it was much the same thing. It was using islands to try and block vision and to keep the enemy's direct line of fire away from me. It's not really the kind of ship where you want to sit behind an island as you would with American light cruisers. It doesn't have the fire arcs for that. You do have to be more on the move, but if you can be on the move and keep islands between you and keep other ships around you that people might want to pick on, then yes, this can do very well, especially over time, because it has that heal and it can sustain damage in a way that most of the other tier 5 cruisers just can't, and it can output damage in a way that the Emerald can't, especially with its ability to set fires. So, yeah, this could still potentially be a tier 6, you know, you slap some extra hit points, a bit of extra range on there, then most of the other stats would still be kind of tier 6 worthy, but Wargaming, as I said, they seem particularly wedded to the idea that this should be a tier 5, and it's fine as a tier 5, it works, it's very strong in some situations. Although it is mostly strong against other cruisers and, to a lesser extent, battleships. But yeah, if left alone, this is a powerful ship. So, you know, if you see one, shoot at it, basically. That is the counter to a powerful ship. I'm sure people will realise this over time, and it'll be just like with the Belfast. If people see one, they will try quite hard to take it down. Although it might better get away with that at tier 5 than tier 7. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. So that is HMS Exeter. Hopefully you found this video useful, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.